Lullabot video.
So if we could leave you with one thing in this video, it's that performance and scalability isn't just about Drupal. There's so many other pieces to the mix that go into making a fast, scalable website. In this case, we use Drupal. But really, there's a lot of other pieces that come into play. You have your operating system, you have your web server, your database server. So what we did is we gave you the most common worn path for optimizing and scaling a Drupal site. So we took a look at the operating system. We went in and we installed Apache and we made our tweaks to Apache. We talked about max clients for Apache and how that affects the site. We talked about keep alive requests. We went over to PHP and installed PHP. We looked at the memory settings, the memory limit for PHP, the execution time. We went over and installed MySQL, and we looked at some of the basic tweaks for MySQL. Remember, we swapped out the MyISM storage engine for InnoDB because it's a little bit faster. It also has database integrity. And we set up our base installation and then installed Pressflow, which was a distribution of Drupal geared towards performance and scalability. It's fully compatible with Drupal contributed modules. After we set up our base environment, what we did is we created the different caching layers. We like to think of this as the fast track through, or the express train through the environment. So on the outset, way out here, not directly in our stack, but way out here, we talked about CDNs, the content delivery networks. We talked about the different type of CDNs that are out there. The full-blown CDNs, we called those the DNS CDNs because it's just changing the domain name and pointing it to the content delivery network provider of your choice. We talked about what the requirements were in a CDN provider, how many points of presence they have. We talked about the ability for their edge networks to be able to read cookies, because that's how Drupal determines if you're an authenticated user or not. If you're a logged in user to a Drupal site, you're going to have a cookie. So we need the edge networks of the CDN provider to be able to read and parse cookies to intelligently respond to the request. We also talked about partial CDN integration, whether that was just putting a video up on YouTube or whether that was serving all of your images or static assets from a CDN provider, but not the entire site experience, and how Drupal can handle that. We also looked at Varnish, and we used Varnish and CDN and CDNs as a way to talk about how to handle spiky traffic on your site. If you're a news site, if you're a sports site, if you have big bursts of traffic and then it tails back down, both the CDN and Varnish are great for managing those kinds of experiences, for scaling those kinds of experiences. So we looked at setting Varnish in front of Drupal so that it could handle all the anonymous user requests. Inside Apache itself, we looked at mod expires, and we looked at setting that so we could tell the web browser, we could say, hey, you already have this CSS file, you already have this image file, and it hasn't changed. So you don't need to download it from me again. You can just use the one that's in your browser cache. And we looked at that as a way of quickly serving files and assets that we would otherwise have to download again. So on our home page, we had about a 60 kilobyte homepage to download the entire page, and we were serving 48 kilobytes of that content from the browser's cache. So all we had to do was download the HTML file again. So a very fast experience and an easy tweak to make on the server side. And Drupal is already set up with mod expires, so win-win. On the PHP side, we installed an opcode cache. We used APC, which stands for Alternative PHP Cache. And what the opcode cache lets us do is PHP is a dynamically compiled language, so the traditional steps are read the PHP file, compile the PHP file, and then execute the PHP file for every page request. So what an opcode cache does is it keeps that compiled code around, so all we have to do is just execute. It takes 2 of the 3 steps away. It's a considerable speed improvement. Next, we looked at a way of optimizing the authenticated user experience, and we did that by reducing the amount of database queries that actually needed to be sent to the database. We did that by caching those database queries. How did we cache the database queries? We used memcache. So when a user logs into a site and say that site is generating 100 queries for the page, we can offload anywhere from 25 to 60 of those queries into memcache. So we talked about how to set that up, and then we did some benchmarks to see the performance improvements that gave us. Then we looked at the query cache, which is a way inside of MySQL to cache read-only queries. So it's a very fast way to say, for MySQL to say, hey, I've already seen this query. I don't need to pull it from the database again. I can just pull that from my local cache. After we went through and optimized this entire stack, we looked at benchmarking. We looked at a tool called Apache Benchmark. And so when we made significant changes to the site, we ran Apache Benchmark to see how our requests per second increased. So we could see, hey, we made this change, now let's measure the performance increase for the site. So we used Apache Benchmark as a tool for that. We also recommended looking at things like JMeter for more robust load testing kinds of scenarios. After we did the benchmark evaluations, we also looked at scaling a Drupal site. So if performance, you've heard me say this before, if performance is how quickly your site can respond to a request, then scaling is how many of those requests simultaneously can your site handle. So on the scaling side, it was a lot of hardware topology and actually very little about Drupal. It was more about Drupal's preferences and how Drupal prefers to scale. But in the end, you're starting to get into the area of system administration, hosting experts, that kind of stuff. But we looked at topologies. We looked at how Drupal can be just one web server. We looked at how Drupal can be a web server and database server. That can be powering a Drupal site. And we looked at more significant hardware topologies where we had load balancers, firewalls, dedicated search servers, web servers, database clusters, all of those things. And we talked a little bit about a physical hosted environment, a traditional hosted environment versus a cloud hosted environment, and what the differences and similarities are between those. From there, we spent a little bit of time talking about some of the common bottlenecks that you'll find, some of the common performance bottlenecks that you'll find in a Drupal environment. What to do if your site is slowing to a crawl or not responding, how to log in and start to assess the situation. To see if it's a CPU issue, if it's a memory issue, which processes are causing the problems, and tried to give you kind of a roadmap of where to go, and hopefully a little more confidence to go in and help you isolate the server's bottleneck. From there, we talked about Drupal 7 and some of the performance and scalability enhancements that are being written for Drupal 7 currently. Then we talked about further resources for you, where to go to get more information, where to go to follow up on some of the things that we've talked about. So there you have it. We've created a lean, mean Drupal machine, right? We've gone through, we've made Drupal work smarter, not necessarily harder, and we've optimized the entire software stack for Drupal, for serving sites quickly. We followed a couple mantras along the way. One of the mantras that we followed is Drupal's a content management system. So it's really good at managing content, but not so good at knowing when to cache, knowing not when to cache, so on and so forth. So we've introduced other components in here that are good for caching, specific for caching. So we have a strategy for anonymous users, a strategy for authenticated users. One of the other mantras that we follow is protect the database. Drupal is a heavy resource on the database. Its strength is also its weakness, right? It's extensible, it's flexible, it's modular. However, that means that sometimes these database queries happen in isolated segments. So we want to protect the database as much as possible, and we do that through caching queries, we do that through writing great code, all of those sorts of things. But what we've delivered here in this video is a best practice recipe for scaling your Drupal site, a best practice recipe for making it perform. So thank you very much for watching the video. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.